related. So I'm delighted to begin by describing what I see as actually an arc of research integrity. As part of this introduction, really, it's very hard to truncate a whole field that has emerged over the last many years into a 20-minute talk, but really recognizing the spectrum of activities and behaviors and also expectations that form part of the culture in which we all are conducting our research and serving as actors in this research enterprise, regardless of the discipline. So within this arc, I like to think of accountable administrators, which don't necessarily only encompass those at institutions such as universities or research institutes, but also those who are charged with serving in roles at funding agencies or in oversight agencies as part of governments, private institutes, as well as those involved in journal publishing and editors. Each entity that is involved, including professional societies, for example, plays a role, as do the individuals who are form each of those groups. And their attentiveness and actual action to all of the environment around them, as well as their own behaviors and the behaviors of the groups in which they thrive, is fundamental to this arc that I see as part of our spectrum of discussion today. In addition to that, the individual researchers being responsible and actually serving as role models helps us to engage conversations around actually serving as mentors and setting examples as superb supervisors, which is one of the model programs that's been developed over the last years, and actually demonstrating respect for each other as we collaborate and communicate. In addition, there is this contribution and commitment as the Concordat, for example, sets forth these commitments to creating a community that actually fosters a culture of research integrity. And of course, culture is not something that's fixed. It continues to change and evolve. And one of the exciting things that I am honored to witness as one of the people involved in helping with the World Conferences on Research Integrity is that our themes evolve as the field evolves and as different disciplines become more sophisticated, not only in their ways of organizing the data that forms the foundation of their field, but also in the ways of researching and understanding how the activities and behaviors of specific researchers and groups and entities then affect that environment and how we can behave very specifically in order to produce this positive kind of research culture. So the field of research integrity is quite young in quotes, but in fact arises from many different disciplines around the world in a philosophical sense, as far as virtue-based ethics and values and moral codes that have been with us in many different cultures. In fact, I can't think of a single culture that doesn't have its own codes and myths and ways of organizing human behavior that have to do with honesty and responsibility and some form of ethics. I particularly like the Japanese concept called magokoro, which is a true heart. And it is one of the words they use to describe integrity, because integrity, for example, from a personal perspective, doesn't exist in the way that we think of it in the English language, in the Japanese language. So this true heart concept is one that is used as part of self-reflection and being able to look oneself in the mirror and actually feel confident and comfortable and happy about the way in which one is behaving, not only toward oneself, but also toward others. So in this field, as we'll learn in the next few minutes, the World Conferences on Research Integrity have been fundamental to creating a forum for actually discussing these issues on a global stage. For example, the first occurred in Lisbon in 2007, and the second in Singapore in 2010, during which the group of people who came from different disciplines all around the world began to discuss what some of the basic principles for research integrity might mean, and what commitments might be necessary from different actors in the research enterprise. And the basic themes emerged as honesty, accountability, courtesy, and fairness in working with others, and good stewardship of research on behalf of others. Since the Singapore statement, there have also been statements on collaborations in Montreal, as well as, for example, the Amsterdam Agenda and the Hong Kong Principles, which are really wonderful at looking at how to assess researchers in qualitative ways and not just count the number of publications, for example. And we are very excited to be announcing soon the Cape Town statement, which I'll talk about toward the end, which emerged from the World Conference on Research Integrity in Cape Town this past summer. So one of the definitions that I like, because every jurisdiction really has a different definition, is that of University of Edinburgh, which describes conducting research in a way that others can have confidence and trust that research, and not just the process itself, but the methods, the findings, and everything that arises from that. And that means that it can be validated, reproduced, and actually provide some kind of benefit to society. So I almost want to say unfortunately, because the US emphasis on research misconduct in this field has unfortunately contributed for many years to a rather narrow perspective in how research integrity is described. And research misconduct in the US definition, which is more than 30 years old now, actually focuses on fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, and of course across the spectrum of research. And there is a very legal standard that is used, and importantly, the significant departure from accepted practices, which is obviously very difficult to define regardless of the context, but specifically looking at different disciplines and understanding how accepted practice may differ across disciplines, but even within a particular institution across the hall, you could have very different accepted practices. So given this narrow definition, but also very specific procedures for handling allegations of research misconduct, which emerged actually out of a very politically driven field, where there were very high-profile cases that occurred at major universities in the United States, and thankfully some members of Congress who said we need to have an oversight agency to handle this. There was an awful lot of attention in the media to scandals that went wrong, and therefore a lot of focus on what to do when things go wrong. And there is basically one phrase in the US regulation that talks about fostering an environment that promotes the responsible conduct of research. It's very general. And some other funders, for example, the National Science Foundation in the US, have asked for responsible conduct of research training plans, for example, which allow for more detail. But again, leaving the academic field and the academic freedom to emerge on its own and not have government intervention to too great an extent in the training of research and the training of responsible research practices, which is a delicate balance actually around the world, and one that people are struggling with even in their own interpretation of the codes and guidelines that dictate their practice in their particular country or particular university. So just to touch upon, for those who are new to this field, people may often use the acronym FFP. Fabrication is from the Latin fabricare, making up data or results and recording or reporting them. I just use as an example the University of Hawaii executive policy, which is a fairly general one. But acknowledging that this is one that also emerges in many of the policies and procedures that are found around the world because of, as I said, this very focused emphasis of the original US regulation. Falsification is, of course, manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes in some way that the research record is no longer accurately represented and therefore can't be trusted. Plagiarism is using or appropriating another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And this gives rise to an awful lot of authorship disputes, which we'll talk about in a moment. And as I mentioned, there are lots of different codes and guidelines. These are the first two that actually do relate to UK. Unfortunately, not part of Europe, quote unquote, anymore, but still in the spirit of collaboration and also being within the zone of Europe. The ALIA Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, which is actually in the process of being revised right now, sets forth these commitments and principles for various parties, and also has some detail about procedures and how to handle, and expands the definition of, well, serious misconduct is described as falsification, fabrication, plagiarism, and other serious problems, but there are also many other kinds of misconduct or breaches of integrity that can occur within the European Code. And the UK Concordat, as many of you may know, also sets forth these 5 commitments that talk, in my view, in a very positive way about things that institutions and others involved in research can do to foster this environment of research integrity, and particularly with the latest update where there is an opportunity for the institution to provide a statement about what they're doing to actually promote that, and have some wonderful ideas about how to make people not only happy, but reduce their stress and reduce the levels of competitiveness and pressure that are either real or perceived, but somehow denigrating and undermining this thriving environment in which we would all like to work. Another national example is the National Policy Statement of Research Integrity in Ireland, which similarly follows the European Code and then has some specific guidelines for researchers working in Ireland. Of course, is endorsed by funders, as is the UK Concordat and the ALIA Code. And noting that these breaches of integrity that are described also in the code of the ALIA Code, European Code, there are a vast number of things that may find their way into various policies and be actionable, if you will, depending upon an institutional policy, but also any way of undermining the research record or the practice. So some policies actually include bullying and harassment, for example, failure to supervise properly, or reckless supervision. These are things that are fundamental elements of responsible research, and the failure to adhere to these practices can result in very dire circumstances. So it's fantastic that they're being addressed along these lines. There is, of course, this vast diversity as well in the education and training of responsible research. And Liz Wader and colleagues did a wonderful review a few years ago, recognizing that we have very little longitudinal data about the effectiveness of some of our research programs and how they are actually preventing, if that was the goal, research misconduct or breaches of integrity. So there isn't much of a causal link yet that has been made. However, in the World Conferences and in many different individual jurisdictions, as I mentioned, lots of people who are working on this and conducting very rigorous research on these elements are understanding and unraveling different pieces of it as we go to say, well, what is it that may cause this, and how can we address the root cause, for example? So the National Institutes of Health, for example, has just added civility as one of the elements for responsible conduct of research training. And that kind of seems as absurd to me, that we have to train people to be civil, but it does demonstrate the fact that this is lacking in environments where there is this incredible, if not reality, perception of pressure and need to compete with your colleagues and step on people's heads in order to get ahead. So some of the gray areas are actually what pose the most important problems, and though they may be those that don't necessarily fall within any definition or any policy, and they are things that are not answered. So if you're expecting a perfect answer on any of these, I don't believe there is one. So in, for example, determining what the proper authorship standard might be for a specific discipline, that may be something one could put into a definition like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. The ICMJE criteria provides some guidelines for example, medical and biomedical authorship. However, there are many areas where a specific element may not fit into that, and there may be a discipline that has a different standard also when you transpose that to a different country. So looking at the journals for the specific guidelines of that specific journal is probably the first thing I would do. And then I will show some resources, for example, on how to address some of the issues that have been debated by experts in the context of publishing through the Council on Publication Ethics. Another gray area is what constitutes a conflict of interest, for example, and what interests should be disclosed and when and to whom. These are all things that really merit open conversation, not only among those who are handling research integrity at the institution, but also among the researchers as they collaborate and among specifically senior researchers and their early career research students and staff. And defining what the generally accepted research practice is also something that is fundamental to do. And in the context of, for example, a research collaboration, identifying what specific methods might be used, for example, for data collection or data analysis, data sharing, is one way to at least try to create a concise framework around how what agreement has been made for that specific research project and what will be the standard for that specific program of research. So as I mentioned, the Council on Publication Ethics has lots and lots of resources and guidelines. And this is one that emerges frequently as authorship disputes and a guide for new researchers. There are also many different resources that come from the journals themselves, and they have been a very important player in the conversations around research integrity and how to foster this thriving environment. Another element that is critical to consider is the data management element. It's something that has been part of funding requirements in the United States for many years and is finding its way now into other areas. For example, Science Europe has some fantastic guidelines about this, and the European Commission through the Horizon 2020 and beyond programs developed this FAIR acronym, and making sure that data can be found by others later when going back to retrieve and understand in order to be able to replicate, for example, and validate data, making it accessible so that it's well described, and specific software programs, for example, are have ease of use, interoperable and reusable. Of course, in different disciplines will vary vastly. So again, these are lovely principles and guiding concepts, but they need to be specifically addressed in the context of a specific project. So here is an old-fashioned kind of laboratory notebook, and I have seen enough of these in unfortunate cases of research misconduct or breaches of integrity where there were problems in consistency of data collection and consistency of documenting data collection and then analyzing it and interpreting it. And this kind of data, whether it's electronic or paper, will serve as not only the legacy for that specific research project for whatever period of time it needs to be kept, but also protection from any allegations. If something comes up and one is accused of fabricating, falsifying data, or selecting outliers, for example, misrepresenting the data, this is the kind of evidence that can help prove or disprove an allegation of a breach of integrity. So absolutely fundamental to ingrain this when early career researchers, for example, are learning their trade. And in addition, for institutions, which has been done more and more, to have a data steward or a data management staff member who can actually help people understand how to implement standards that will be consistent and rigorous. This is an example from my father's company. He is an archaeologist here in Hawaii. And in any field, this kind of data management is so fundamental. I wanted to touch upon it here in, for example, a burial site. This is an ancient Hawaiian burial, and collecting the bones and any artifacts that are relevant to that specific trench absolutely requires the kind of care and commitment to the actual spiritual element of what it is one is doing, because this is not just a bone. It belonged to a person. That person has a whole story. There is a descendant process. This is an example where elements of research integrity, if you will, have changed over time. When my father first started in Hawaii, for example, there were no rules about having to consult with community members, where they may say, well, my great-great-great-great-grandfather lived on that land, and this may be, I may be a descendant of the individuals who were buried here, and those human remains need to be treated in a specific way. Those laws weren't in place, but for someone who has the kind of sensitivity to go and communicate and get permissions and have a real conversation with members of the community to ensure that the data collection and sharing and analysis, etc., is respecting those cultural traditions is fundamental. And now, of course, the law is changing so that that's required. Nevertheless, regardless of the discipline, this kind of care and commitment really reflects the true heart that is essential to the Japanese definition that I described. I want also to touch upon the Integrity in Practice Toolkit, which was developed by the Royal Society and UKRIO very proudly, and with Frances Downey when she was at the Royal Society. She's now at UKRIO. I'm sorry, UKRI. And this toolkit I have here has all kinds of wonderful positive examples. It's available online, it's free, and it has all kinds of small steps that institutions can take, researchers can take to engage everyone involved to make it relevant in the way that James was describing, as far as embedding integrity and ethics into the institutional culture and agreeing shared expectations. For example, there's the World Economic Forum youth scientist community that said, well, we don't like all these other guidelines as much, so why don't we create our own? And they created their own code of ethics that was real and relevant to them. Another example is creating informal channels to openly discuss research integrity. And Marcus Munafo, who is a fantastic leader in this field and in his own discipline, and has spoken at UKRIO conferences in the past, had an example of a Snapchat where members of his lab found that it was too difficult to send things by email, so they developed a Snapchat that they used to describe their triumphs and disasters and support each other. Oh, I lost my microscope. Does anyone have a microscope? Oh, yes. Okay, good. I got my paper accepted. And just to really help each other in ways that are meaningful to them. University of Glasgow is another example, here with Elizabeth Adams, who was instrumental in developing University of Glasgow's system around research integrity, and also identifying the research integrity champions, who are not as intimidating per se as the vice president or provost to whom one typically has to go to report some kind of concern around research integrity. Instead, to embed champions across the disciplines and at different levels, where there is more of an opportunity for informal conversation and assistance in going forward with an allegation, understanding what it is. And if, for example, there are issues of bullying and harassment, something like that, that those can be addressed rather than just, okay, now you're in the process, you have to be a whistleblower, and you're off on this journey that you may not be prepared to take. So the international perspectives I mentioned in the very beginning are what excites me the most about this entire field. And as I've said, this group of people who come together from so many different disciplines and are able to disagree with each other and debate these issues and delve into deep, rigorous research, as well as take the field to new levels and acknowledge that it actually is quite an old field when it's grounded in ethics and some of the philosophical underpinnings of virtue and responsible behavior. So in our past meeting we had just in May, June of this year, the Cape Town Statement had just released the preprint, which the site is available here. And the publication is coming out very soon. This is about integrating, for example, fairness, equity, and diversity in conversations around research integrity, that in order to have integrity, we need to have efforts that reduce this power imbalance and to have clarity among authorship policies where there is a fair treatment of every partner involved, and reduce some of that stigma, if you will, around the research intensive countries and institutions that develop the research agenda because they have the funds to do so, and then those in other countries who have to basically follow and not develop the priorities on their own and as true partners. So look for that. It will be quite an exciting paper once it is released. And we also were thrilled to announce our next World Conference will be in Athens in 2 years' time, and we plan to have a bridging event, hopefully online, in May or June of this coming year, 2023. And the theme is being refined as we speak, but I have no doubt it will be absolutely fascinating, and perhaps we'll again come back to some of the deeper ethics-based and virtue-based conversations that may have got lost in the sort of legal paradigm in the last 30 years or so. These are some references and resources. There are so many, I could have had 10 slides on this. And just wish to thank my absolutely stellar members, Sheila McLean at the University of Glasgow in bioethics, for example, where she had the idea of bringing together law and ethics in medicine to create a bioethics degree when I was much younger. And just acknowledging the many different disciplines that contribute to the field of research integrity. For example, I had this opportunity to be able to learn about pulling things from different disciplines in order to create this beautiful spectrum of research integrity as part of the arc I described. So thank you very much. And I would take any questions if there are any in the chat.
Zoe, thank you very much. That was a fascinating introduction to research integrity and a reminder of how fundamental and relevant it is to all the research that we do. This is about making sure our research is of high quality and high ethical standards, and doing what we can individually and collectively to make sure the environments in which we work promote that. So it's fascinating your perspective on the issues. Thank you very much. Okay, we have a few questions in the Q&A already, but please do keep popping them in. Initially, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. He says, do you feel that data management and openness should be a criteria to examine PhD dissertations in the future?
So data management is one criteria that is fantastically handled, for example, by the University of Hong Kong. I had the chance to go there and say, okay, we thought we had this good system in the US where, for example, the funders require a data management plan as part of a grant application or progress report. But in Hong Kong, they said, oh, that's not good enough. So they actually had early career researchers, master's, PhD students required to upload their data management plans and make them visible and accessible so that there could be oversight, not only from their mentors, but also from the broader institution to be able to help them understand how to do this right and how to think through data management prior to actually going through the whole process of doing their master's thesis or their PhD. So as far as data management being fundamental to PhDs, I think Hong Kong is a great example. And then open science has a bit, or open research has lots and lots of positive elements. We do know this is also something with Plan S and lots of other initiatives that are being encouraged. There are also some imbalances that are created. However, I had the honor of being the guest editor for a journal in forensic sciences, where actually Frances Downey and Rebecca Veitch at UKRI contributed a fantastic piece for that on research culture. But in that context, for example, there was an article processing fee, and some people from some countries were not able to pay that. So it is one of the disadvantages in the way that the burden has now shifted to many authors for having to pay the processing fees. Some jurisdictions have made it where the institution itself will pay for those, or the grant, if it's publicly funded or even privately funded, can pay for article processing fees as part of a budget. So in order to make it a requirement, it has to be that, for example, a PhD student has the funds to be able to make their data open. And of course, it should be open as possible, closed as necessary, recognizing legal and regulatory requirements for patient confidentiality, for example. But that's a long-winded answer, hopefully, that yes, and yes with some caution.
That's great. Thank you very much. Carolyn asks, what areas of research best practice do you feel are most commonly overlooked or not considered by UK institutions?
Oh, I'm certainly not an expert in UK institutions other than having studied at University of Edinburgh and Glasgow. I think one of the things that needs more attention, not just in the UK, but around the world, is mentoring and supervision. So we've got all this focus on you need to have integrity, you need to do your methodology, and you're pressured and you're doing all this. But those who are mentoring you either are not necessarily setting a good example, like I'm very lucky, I've had fantastic mentors, or they were never really trained as to how to be a mentor, how to be a good supervisor. And so the idea of, for example, having career development mentor or a writing mentor, and then a scientific or other disciplinary mentor to help address specific aspects, because we must look at it in a holistic way. We can't simply say, this is my mentor who's helping me with my project, and deny that we actually have a life and our life is falling apart because we're working so hard. So I think it is mentoring and supervision would be one that I think would merit more attention, and training and support for those who are learning how to mentor regardless of their age.
That's really helpful, thank you. If someone finds themselves in a kind of mentor position because, you know, they're a principal investigator perhaps, or a head of department or a school, or they're just, you know, a veteran researcher, and they wake up in the morning and they find, gosh, people are looking up to me. What do you think that people in those positions can do to encourage researchers to engage with issues of research integrity and help improve their local environments?
Well, one example I'm thinking of is Tamarint Haven in the Netherlands has developed this superb supervision workshop, and I believe she's made some of it available. I think some of it is available online, where people can actually learn how to be a better mentor, is one example. Another is that I mentioned with Marcus Munafo, where actually asking your research team and your early career researchers, it seems it's very obvious, but you would want to ask, what is it you need in order for me to be a better mentor? And for example, it's not just, I'm the boss, I'm going to tell you what to do and you're going to follow my orders. It's, let's have a shared agreement and shared expectations, and maybe even a mentoring agreement where it's not just I need to follow the mentor's rules, but the mentor also needs to live up to my expectations. And if it's not working, because certainly we've all had bad bosses and situations that haven't worked, then there is a forum for discussion and resolution, and actually separation if it doesn't work. So those are two elements I would consider.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Zoe. We'll bring the session to a close now. I'd like to thank you for the very insightful talk. I appreciate having been able to answer all the questions in the Q&A, but we'll see what we can do answering those through the chat function or perhaps later on in the session. So thank you all very much for your questions now. Zoe, that was great. Thank you very much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the question.